The topic that I've given you for tonight is the Cataphatic and Apophatic theology in the works and life of C.S. Lewis. Tom told me by email yesterday, I think it was yesterday, that in doing a little bit of asking around, nobody knew what Cataphatic and Apophatic were. And I replied, good, that's exactly what I had hoped for. Those two terms are from Greek origins. Okay, let me kind of break them apart. I don't speak Greek, so don't start firing Greek questions at me. But they're from Greek origins. Alex knows Greek, so I'll have him come up. The phatic part comes from the Greek word phasis, meaning speech, to communicate. Okay, so someone has a stroke and they suffer aphasia. That's the lack of ability to speak. Okay? The kata and the apo are prepositions. And when they get added to phasis, they then say something about speech or speaking or communication. Kata is a preposition that means down into or kind of together with or among. Okay? So when you put that with speech, it kind of means speech or language or communication that can be said about something clearly, understandably. All right? Apophatic is almost the exact opposite. Apo means away or apart from. So it is speech that is not clear, not direct, not necessarily understandable. All right? So, cataphatic and apophatic. In the Middle Ages, especially in the West, those two terms weren't used, cataphatic and apophatic. The two terms that were used in place of them were via affirmativa, the affirmative way or the positive way, and via negativa, the negative way. All right? And both terms are used to describe our knowledge of God, or what we can say about God, what we know about God, things like that. So let me give you some examples, and then I'll pause for questions. For cataphatic theology, those of you who are Protestant, you're probably very familiar with this kind of theology, even though you may have never heard the term. Cataphatic theology is largely theology based upon God's revelation to us about himself. That is, it is propositional statements about God. For example, Francis Schaeffer wrote a book, God, the God who is there. Okay? God is there. God exists. Shortest definition of God in the New Testament. Anybody know what it is? God is love. Okay? 1 John 4. God is love. God, subject, is, linking verb, complement, love. So you link God with love. God is merciful, God is just, God is powerful, God is omnipotent. You get the idea. These are all positive statements about God. They're telling us something about the attributes of God. Okay? Clear on that? Apophatic theology, now, keep in mind this is the negative way. Apophatic theology is almost the opposite. Apophatic theology says, ultimately, that we cannot know God aside from an experience of God. Okay? But when it says that, or when it acknowledges that, what it is doing is not saying that we can't know God in how God has manifested himself to us. It's saying we cannot know God in his essence. So, because of the limitations of human language, because of the limitations of the human mind, we cannot understand God. So to say God is love is doing what? In a cataphatic way. You're defining. Okay? What does the word define literally mean? You're putting a limit around. You're putting God in a box. Well, what's the particular box in that instance?
Love.
What kind of love, though?
Human love. Love we understand.
It's our understanding of love, which is totally and entirely based upon our experience of human love. But every person in this room, I think, I won't, state it categorically, has experienced love that has let you down. So when we say God is love, do we mean God is that kind of love? Probably not. So in apophatic theology, the idea is to try to get to God essentially by saying or by acknowledging what God is not. God is not love. God is not merciful. God is not just. Okay? C.S. Lewis, and I think it's one of the quotes I'm going to read in a few minutes, says, I think this is in Letters to Malcolm, this also is God. This, talking about the same referent as the previous this, also is not God. Well, why? To understand this, you've got to essentially go back to some early fathers of the church who are very difficult to understand. I do not presume to understand them by any means other than the literal meanings of the words that are on the page that get translated into English, who say, we cannot know God, we cannot understand God, we cannot fathom God. All we can do is try to experience God, all right? Because God is beyond our realm of existence. Even when we say God exists, when we use that term exists, what denotes it? Our understanding of existence. But how God exists is completely beyond us. Okay? And the classic work of early church theology that kind of defines this is by a writer named Pseudo-Dionysius. He called pseudo because he used to be thought that this was Dionysius the Areopagite that St. Paul mentions. Okay? But it's not him because this guy's a little bit later. Pseudo-Dionysius, in two particular works, really expounds. I was going to say most clearly, but that wouldn't be right. But he really expounds in the most clear fashion what is meant by this apophatic theology. And one work is called The Mystical Theology. The very first title ought to give you a clue. It's not straightforward. And the other work is titled On the Divine Names. Okay? And both works are works that attempt to help us to understand who God is. And what he does in both is essentially say, God is not, and then gives us categories. Because all the categories that he gives are, as we've already discussed, categories of human thought. And God obviously is not a category of human thought. If anything, he is so far beyond human thought. A later medieval theologian, Saint Anselm, I believe it was, said God, his definition was God is the highest that can be thought. Well, even that, however, isn't apophatic, because that limits God to the highest realm of human thought. But God is so far beyond our thought. Well, how do we know? Look at what, for example, St. Paul says. Good scotch is going to fall. I don't want it to. St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. Now let me back up. Romans 11, 33 to 35. St. Paul says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord?" Now, we could spend the rest of our lives, literally, just trying to understand that one passage. Now, listen to that again. "Well, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgment, and his ways past finding out." Where do we see a fantastic example of that in the Old Testament?
God is not in the fire, God is not in the earthquake.
God's not in the fire, he's not in the earthquake, he's not in the burning bush. Okay? The bush is burning. Yes, God is not the burning bush. What's another example? That involves the judgments of God, the wisdom of God. The book of Job. Think of how the book of Job concludes. Job's had these horrible things happen to him. He's not sure why. He trusts God. He believes in God, etc. But he essentially tells his friends, you know, I want to sit down and talk with God. I want God to justify to me, essentially, why all this is happening. And God appears. How does God appear? Does he appear in a manifestation, a theophany, as a person? Does he appear like, the famous icon by Rublev? The three individuals at the Oaks of Mamre? No. How does he appear? Tornado. A whirlwind. And what does he do? And what kind of questions are they?
Where were you when I made the world?
In other words, they were unanswerable questions. How much more apophatic can you get than that? Where were you when I made the world? Where were you when I came up with the idea of the snowflake? Where were you when I framed the foundations of the universe? Where were you? What is Job's ultimate response? Sorry. I mean, think about that for a moment. Job realizes, who am I? To question God, the creator of all, the being beyond all being. Okay? The potter that made the pot. Okay? So that's really the apophatic way. One last kind of scriptural element. 1 Corinthians 13:12. Now we see in a glass darkly. But what? But then face to face. Now this is going to be very important for one of the books by Lewis that I'm going to talk about later. But then face to face. Now I know in part. How do we know in part? How do we know, in other words, what we know of God? His acts. What else?
Self-revelation of himself to us.
Bingo. Okay. His actions, which are experienced, which have been experienced by the people of Israel, whether the physical people of Israel or the spiritual people of Israel, okay, and his revelation to us. Both general revelation, nature, the world around us, the heavens declare the glory of God, says the psalmist, and his special revelation. The Old Testament, the New Testament, and his most special revelation, Christ. Okay? The express image of God according to Hebrews, and the exact the exact image and the express glory of God. Okay? That's how we know what we know about God. If it weren't for those, we would be completely in the dark. Right? And even with that knowledge, we see throughout Scripture people who were completely in the dark. Think about when Moses goes up Sinai. I'm not talking about the burning bush. After the Exodus, when Moses goes up on Sinai, what does Sinai look like from below? It's covered in darkness. Covered in darkness. Okay? In other words, he is ascending into the unknown. He's ascending to God, who conceals himself. All right? Okay, before I go on and try to relate these or give examples of these in C.S. Lewis, any questions or comments? Yes?
Well, when you mention this, it reminds me of the Jewish usage of the word Yahweh, not even trying to define God by a word.
Say that again.
What this reminds me of is the usage of the word Yahweh. people not even trying to define the word or limit God by a title of human origin.
Sure. And even refusing to say the word God. I mean, I've had a couple of Jewish students at the university, one who wrote a paper that won a national award about portrayals of God or something like that in the 17th century. And every time she needed to say God, G asterisk D. Okay. Any others?
Well, I have one.
Okay.
I mean, as an Orthodox, we accept the Apophatic Theology. But one of the principles of Orthodoxy is that God is love.
Mm-hmm.
Not that that's an attribute, but that is what God is. How do we reconcile what you said with that? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I do. And I'm going to respond to that in some context in talking about Lewis. Because, take that back. No, I won't, because I'll respond to it now. For the simple the reason I'm going to respond to it now is when I wrote out the notes I have and pulled passages that I want to read from Lewis. There was one essay that I didn't pull anything from, even though I had intended to. And it's an essay by Lewis titled Transposition. It's in the little collection, The Weight of Glory and Other Essays. And it's an essay where Lewis is talking about how we talk about God, or how we know things that are unknown and unknowable. And he essentially says we do it through metaphor. We do it through metaphor and through images. For example, we talk about God as Father. Well, when we do that, what do we mean? We don't mean literal Father. What does every person have in mind when they hear that word? Their own human physical father. They associate with that word attributes of fatherhood. Okay? So that we take what Lewis calls this kind of lower level understanding and we transpose that to a higher level. So, for example, when Christ quotes the passage of the Old Testament, I can't remember, I think it's Isaiah, talking about, wanting to shelter Jerusalem under his wings like a hen. I mean, even that, like a hen. Talking of similes there. Why? Because God is not a hen. God is not the great, cosmic chicken that shelters its children that way. So how must we talk about God if we're going to talk about God is love? Which, as Orthodox and as non-Orthodox, we all accept God is love. Well, we see that. Where do we see it? On the cross. That is, we have experiential knowledge of that truth. Okay? And it is a truth. But it is a truth that can only be experienced. That is, Lewis will talk to some extent, and I'm going to show where he stops talking, because this is important. Lewis will show to some extent how far language and propositional truth about God can get us. How many of you have read Mere Christianity? I'm assuming most, okay? Problem of Pain. That's what I thought. A little bit fewer. Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. Yeah, even, okay? Mere Christianity is the most popular thing among Christians, Orthodox, non-Orthodox, that Lewis ever wrote. Why? Because it's about mere Christianity. That is, it's about the kind of Christianity that all, even using, now I've got to be careful with terms, that all true Christians acknowledge. Okay? In other words, a Unitarian who might call him or herself a Christian is not a Christian, because a Unitarian does not acknowledge the Trinity. A Unitarian does not acknowledge Christ as the second person of the Trinity, etc. Okay? But because it talks about all Christianity. That is Christianity that all true Christians acknowledge and such. Even in Mere Christianity, in the book, chapter, or section that was originally published as a book called Beyond Personality, he starts to talk about the Trinity and such. Okay? And what does he do even there? He uses images. For example, he gives an example of the Trinity. He says something to the effect of, the Trinity is like a cube. How is the Trinity like a cube? Well, a cube has multiple sides, and yet it's still a cube. The Trinity has multiple persons, and yet it's still one God. One God, three persons, one cube, six sides. Okay? But again, notice how he makes that argument. Image. By simile. Because if we try to rationalize ourselves to the Trinity, it can't be done. Try to rationally take apart, delve into the incarnation. I mean, this is something that's bugged the bejeebies out of me for 35 years at least. You know, trying to understand it cannot be understood how God, that thing beyond all being, that person beyond all being, can take form as an embryo in a human being and get delivered and have to have his diapers changed and have to have his nose wiped and have to learn how to walk and stumble and fall and scrape his knees, all the way up to willingly accepting the cross. I don't know, maybe one of you can understand it, but I'm just not there. I accept it, yes. But I can't rationally up here understand it. And Lewis, I think, kind of came to that same kind of realization. I mean, Lewis, it's not an accident that in Surprised by Joy, Lewis calls himself the most reluctant convert in England. He did not want to convert to Christianity. He wanted nothing to do with it, but he did. Why? Not because somebody logically proved the truth of Christianity to him, because God wouldn't leave him alone. He talks about God as hounding him everywhere he turned. What did he meet? Robert smiling. What did he meet? Everywhere. When he got to Oxford. Other Christians. And not just Christians in name only. Committed, believing Christians. Hugo Dyson, Humphrey Havard, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams after a while. Okay? And he starts to discover all of the literature that he loves, really loves. It's all by Christians. Okay? It's all by Christians. So it's like he's being hemmed in after a while. Okay? Other questions before I go on? Did I answer your question, Tom? To the best of my ability?
Other questions? This may be similar, in a similar direction to what Tom was asking, but you spoke of Scripture as having sort of these sides as well. By and large, would you put even Scripture in one category or another, or is it that when we see truth in Scripture, they do speak to us in our experience, but it would seem like, I think we would suggest they're also beyond us in many ways. Or are they just speaking to us as we understand it with much more that's undefined beyond? I don't know exactly how to ask that.
I think it's more the latter. I mean, I'm not a scriptural scholar by any means. But I do think it's probably much more the latter, meaning, you can read Scripture only, That the only thing you would ever read for the rest of your life, and you would never get to the bottom of it. Somebody was, in the conversation before, was talking about reading something, and it's like the more you read, the more layers of onion skin there are to peel back. Well, that's essentially the experience of God. What is the Old and New Testament? It's the experience of God. It's the experience of God first by the Jews, but then it's the experience of God by the Christians in the early church. And what do we see in that experience? Do you ever fully experience God fully and go, oh, I get it now? No. St. Gregory of Nyssa says that our experience of God in the resurrected life will be from glory to glory. It will just be this continual enlightenment, this continual illumination. Why? Well, because according to the Orthodox Church, we are participating in, partaking of God now. You know, every day, every Sunday, every liturgy one is at where one partakes of the Eucharist, one is partaking of God there. That's not just an empty act that doesn't do anything to the individual partaking. It's transformative. But how does it transform? It might be slowly, or it might be more quickly. You know, it's not an accident that when you look at lives of the saints and stuff, some of the saints, I really dislike these ones because they make me feel, you know, what have I done with my life? But some of the saints are sanctified, let's say, by the time they're 25 or 30. St. Pantaleimon, if I remember right, died before he was 30. Okay? And was pretty much acknowledged very quickly that he was a saint. That is, he had achieved a level of illumination, or a level of, to use the Orthodox term, theosis, divinization, here on earth in his life, okay, that will only be magnified to whatever degree in the life to come. The life that he is now enjoying, partially, because his body hasn't been resurrected yet. But when the body is resurrected, when he takes on the risen body as Christ took on his risen body, okay, that body then participates in that whole process of theosis. And it's that theosis where we ultimately come to know God. How? As we are known, face to face.
You know, that passage that you read by St. Paul, we will know him when we see him face to face. I've always applied that passage to eternity.
Mm-hmm.
But thinking about what you're saying, and what Moses knew God because he experienced him face to face. I mean, that face-to-face experience doesn't necessarily have to be in eternity.
Well, no, he didn't experience him face to face. He saw the backside of God.
Well, he experienced
But yes, he did experience God. And how did Moses appear when he came down from the mountain? Radiating God's glory. So, yeah, it can be experienced here in this life. I mean, that's what the Orthodox faith teaches is the goal of human life. Theosis in this life. That's the goal. And it's to get off of Lewis entirely, it's essentially what both St. Simeon the theologian and St. Gregory Palamas essentially wrote about. I mean, St. Gregory Palamas in the 14th century had to defend this idea against a Latin Roman Catholic priest who said, it's impossible to experience God the way you're talking about. And St. Gregory Palamas said, no, it is possible. In fact, it's required. I mean, his idea was that everybody, to be a true Christian, should experience God in this life. I'm not there yet, sorry. Think, leave orthodoxy aside for a moment. Leave C.S. Lewis aside for a moment. Think of Mother Teresa. How many of you know the basic story of Mother Teresa? Right? Terry does. On a train in 1947, she had a religious experience. She had a vision where God called her to go to Calcutta and to take care of the lowest of the low, the outcast, the despised, the dejected, those that nobody else would have anything to do with. She went to her priest. Her priest said yes. She goes to Calcutta. Okay. She has this moving, what we would call mystical experience. And then what happens over the next 50 years? Nothing. Nothing. I don't mean nothing. She doesn't follow God's command, his charge. No, she goes and she takes care of the poor. She dies on the same day as Princess Diana. Princess Diana gets all the news in the world. Mother Teresa pretty much dies with very little fanfare. And then a few years after her death, a priest publishes her letters. And what are her letters largely about? Was it really doubt?
But doubt is not settled unbelief.
That's true.
Doubt is doubt.
Bingo. It is the dark night of the soul. It is, where is God?
The psalmist asked that question.
Sure he does. 50 years. I mean, she has this experience as a young girl. And for 50 years, what do you think, is going to happen to you if you have that experience when you're in your 20s or 30s? You want to have it again, right? She doesn't have it again, ever. She feels, according to her letters, God doesn't answer her prayers. She feels like God has closed the door on her. And yet what does she do? She remains faithful. She goes on. Why? Because she did have the one experience. She is sure. Okay?
And Lewis actually talks about that in his 3 big letters when he talks about the undulations. And when he's exhorting the under demon, not to get too much of an aside, but he's
No, it's not an aside at all.
telling him about when he's tempting him, to not tempt him when he's at the top of the undulation, because God's presence is his very reward, and those temptations are nothing to him. What he wants to do is tempt him when he's at the bottom of the undulation, when God seems far away and the heavens are brass. That's what he wants to bring the temptation and come on like fire. But if the patient resists those temptations, even though God seems far away and distant, that's when the demon ought to really be concerned, because that's what Lewis talks about.
Exactly. Lewis says in Screwtape, it's those periods of dryness that when the patient is faithful, God loves that the most.
Right.
Well, okay. Lewis writes Screwtape in 38, I believe. Jump to 1960. What book does Lewis publish in 1960? Under the pseudonym N.W. Clerk, A Grief Observed, which is about the death of his wife. Any of you know what he says in A Grief Observed? Where is God? This isn't right. In fact, he calls God the divine vivisector. That is, the divine, what's the other word for vivisector? Dissector, sorry. That God took Lewis, essentially, and cut him open. He says, here I was, a happy, bachelor. I had everything going for me. Everybody knew who I was. And then you bring this woman into my life who's a little difficult at first to get along with. But then they fall madly in love. And don't believe what Walter Hooper says. Walter Hooper says that C.S. Lewis and Joy David Mint Gresham never, for example, consummated their marriage. Complete lunacy. Because all you have to read is A Grief Observed, where he talks about loving her with every inch of his body and every part of his soul. All right? God brings her into his life, and then what happens? 4 years later, he rips her away. Why? What kind of God is that? And he goes on, how can we talk about God being good if this is what a good God does? I mean, that's pretty strong language for the guy who wrote The Problem of Pain in Mere Christianity. Because, you know, if you've not read Problem of Pain, what's it about? It is a rational explanation for why pain exists. How rational is it to explain pain to someone who's suffering? I mean, how many of you have been to, you know, people on their deathbeds, people in, you know, cancer wards, etc., and you go up to them and they go, oh, it's okay, really. God's just, to use a line that was used in the film Shadowlands far too often, God's just using this as a megaphone to rouse you. No. Okay? And here's why I think that happens. I'll get on into, to Lewis now. Here's why that happens. Most of Lewis's apologetical material, most of his theological material is written in the early to mid 1940s. Okay? He wrote Screwtape, I think it was in 38. Anybody know what happened as a result of his writing Screwtape? He got his face on the cover of Time magazine with a little demon on one side and a little angel on the other, if I remember correctly. A woodcut image. Okay? An Oxford Dawn, a pinhead. All right? Why? Because this book struck a chord. People read that book, and people still read it. I mean, I teach it in my Inklings course. It just blows people away who've never read it before. Okay? But he writes that in 1938. Now, that's fiction, obviously. Yet, how does Screwtape write to his nephew? What does he use to try to convince his nephew what to do to win his patient to our infernal Father below? He uses logic. Logic. He uses Lewisian crystal clear logic with, got to throw this one little caveat in, just a slight twist. Which is why Lewis says in the preface, you know, remember as you read this, the devil's a liar. So that when you read Screwtape's words, you have to weigh them. You have to sift them. Okay? So he writes that in 1938. In 1940, he writes The Problem of Pain, okay, which is essentially his attempt to explain why pain exists. It's his attempt to answer the question, where is God when it hurts? Why does a good God allow bad things to happen? Period. All right? And how does he go about answering that? Through his use of reason and logic. And a lot of cataphatic theology. Propositional statements about God. Okay? Then he, on the basis of Screwtape and The Problem of Pain, the BBC of all organizations asks him to deliver lectures over the BBC on Christianity during the war. He does 3 sets of lectures, right, that get published in 1942, 43, and 44. The first lecture is titled Broadcast Talks, the second lecture, Christian Behavior, and the third lecture, Beyond Personality. The first lecture is all about essentially morality. It's trying to get a common framework for his hearers to understand what he's going to talk about later on. And it's essentially getting people to understand that everybody has this notion of fairness. Our ideas of fairness might differ, but we all have an idea of fairness. In other words, I might not think it fair that Alex is sitting right there right now smoking a pipe and I don't get to, okay? But Ed may think it's fair. See, we have a different idea of what is fair, but we both have a notion of, ultimately, this idea of fairness. And Lewis uses that to say, well, because we both have that, there must be some standard that creates this idea of fairness. We'll call it God. for lack of a better thing. So then he goes on in the next section, Christian behavior, to talk about, okay, so if we do acknowledge that Christ is God, what does that mean? And that entails certain kinds of behavior on parts of people. When I teach my Inklings class, that's the most difficult part of Mere Christianity to teach. Because what is Lewis talking about in that section on Christian behavior? A lot of it's about sexual morality, which in a public university of 26,000 students with every kind of sexuality you can imagine, okay, and not all my students in that Inklings course are Christian. Most of them are, but not all of them. It can get interesting. And then the third book is Beyond Personality, where he gets into talking about the Trinity. Now, notice even that those two words, beyond personality. When we talk about God being a personal God, what do we mean? Like us. Okay? Relatable. I hope he's not like us. I mean, no offense to any of you. Let me rephrase it. I hope he's not like me. Okay? So that personality we've got to rise above that. We've got to try to get to something beyond that. All right? So that's later, those three talks get published as Mere Christianity in 1952 with very little revising. Lewis just kind of changes the audience from people listening to their radio, to their wireless, to a written audience. Okay? What else does he write? In 1947, he writes a little book titled Miracles, which personally I think is the most difficult book that Lewis ever wrote. I read it and my eyes kind of glaze over, and it's everything kind of over my head. Okay? And then he doesn't write anymore. He stops. Okay? Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer, is published in 1964. It is what it sounds like. It's a series of letters that he wrote to a close friend. It is not a theological argument, the way Miracles, Mere Christianity, and The Problem of Pain were. Okay? It's a conversation. Is it theological in nature? Yes. All right? But it's not like Mere Christianity. It's not Lewis standing there or sitting there showing you how brilliant he is with his deductive logic. And Lewis really was brilliant. Lewis kind of, in the 1940s, he revived what's called the Oxford Union, which is the Oxford Socratic Club. And he was its president. He would invite people to come debate. He would set the topic, or the group in charge would set the topic. Lewis was often one of the debaters. It got to the point where not many people wanted to come debate, because Lewis usually wiped the floor clean with them. But in 1948, he did debate a philosopher, a Catholic philosopher, who wanted to debate with him about one of the chapters in that book, Miracles. And the debate was over whether Lewis's argument in the third chapter, which is about naturalism, okay, whether or not the central premise of that chapter is correct. And Lewis's premise, and we're not going to go into it, but his premise is that naturalism is logically self-defeating. It cannot be true. And the result of that is a logical proof for the existence of God. All right? When the debate finished, according to some of Lewis's students and friends, he thought he lost. He thought he lost bad. He thought she wiped the floor up with him. She didn't have that impression when she wrote about it later on. Okay? But Lewis did. And I don't know if there's a cause and effect relationship here, but he stops debating. He stops writing about theology at that point. 1950, what does he write? Language in the Wardrobe. It's about as far from theology as you can get. You know, big giant lion and talking mice and, dancing bears and all that kind of stuff. Is it free of theology? No. Does it have Cataphatic and Apophatic theology? Yes, it does have both. Okay. What kind of lion is Aslan? He's not a tame one. All right. And then he finishes the rest of the Chronicles of Narnia. In about 1952, I believe it is, this obnoxious woman from New Jersey moves to England to meet her idol. They have corresponded previously. Okay. This is Joy David McGresham. They had corresponded previously, and they meet. She moves up to Oxford, okay, and they develop a relationship, and it's because of her, Lewis tells us. It is specifically because of her that Lewis is able to write this book, Till We Have Faces. Till We Have Faces. Okay? Subtitled A Myth Retold. This book, Till We Have Faces, is the old Greek myth of Cupid and Psyche, kind of refashioned. This is something Lewis had been trying to write since about 1930. So for about 26 years, he'd been wanting to write this, but he could never just get it right. And it's only after meeting Joy David McGresham that everything just kind of clicks and falls into place. And he writes the story. Later on, he will call it, of all of his works, his favorite. So, his favorite over Paralandra in the Space Trilogy, over Mere Christianity, over Screwtape. Screwtape was his least favorite. He hated Screwtape. For the simple reason that it was about the easiest thing he ever wrote. Because he said all he had to do was let the dark out to express Screwtape's thinking. Okay? So he writes Till We Have Faces, which, as I said, is about this Greek myth. And he and Joy David McGresham get married in 1956. They live happily. Okay? Well, let me rephrase that. Let me back up. They get married in 1956, first in a civil ceremony, because she's on her deathbed. She has cancer, and they think she's dying. She is dying. And they have a civil ceremony, okay, first to keep her so that she doesn't have to leave the country. But then they have a religious ceremony. And whereas Lewis and Tolkien had been good friends up until the time Lewis went to Cambridge, the divorce came between them because she was a divorced woman. And Tolkien, the staunch Catholic that he was, could not take his friend marrying a divorcee. And it caused a rift between them. So after the civil ceremony, they have a religious ceremony. Why? Because Lewis wanted them to be married not only in the eyes of the state, but to be married in the eyes of God as well. And lo and behold, she has a relapse. She has remission. The cancer goes away. And they have a period of about 4 years of, for lack of a better term, bliss. They're able to do things they both wanted to do but had never been able to do before, like go to Greece. Okay? They go to the Oracle of Delphi. They go to the Parthenon. They go to Athens. A whole bunch of stuff. They get back from Greece. Her cancer's back, and she dies within months. And Lewis is destroyed. I mean destroyed. All you have to do is read A Grief Observed to see how destroyed he is. All right? Now let me back up. Let me pause for a moment. Any questions, comments at this point? Anybody? Okay. Let me read a couple of examples from Lewis of what I think are examples of cataphatic theology and then apophatic theology, and then talk about the latter more than I will the former. And you can get a really good introduction. In fact, you can get a very good grounding in Lewis just by buying this one book, The Complete C.S. Lewis. Okay? Doesn't include a lot of his fiction, but it does include some. Includes Screwtape and the Great Divorce. In Mere Christianity, he says, and this is a long passage, but I am going to read it all because it's essential Lewis. He says, and this is in the Beyond Personality book. Okay, it's the last one. He says, I warn you that theology is practical. Now that Pseudo-Dionysius I referred to earlier, he would never say theology is practical. St. Maximus the Confessor would never say theology is practical. Probably St. Seraphim of Sarath would not say theology is practical. The whole purpose for which we exist is to be thus taken into the life of God. Wrong ideas about what that life is will make it harder. And now for a few minutes I must ask you to follow rather carefully. You know that in space you can move in three ways. Left, right, backwards, forwards, up, or down. Every direction is either one of these three or a compromise between them. They're called the three dimensions. Now notice this. If you're using only one dimension, you could draw only a straight line. If you're using two, you could draw a figure, say a square. And a square is made up of four straight lines. Now a step further. If you have three dimensions, you can build in what we call a solid body, say a cube, like a dice or a lump of sugar. And a cube is made up of 6 squares. Do you see the point? A world of one dimension would be a straight line. In a two-dimensional world, you still get straight lines, but many lines make one figure. In a three-dimensional world, you still get figures, but many figures make one solid body. In other words, as you advance to, this is key, more real and more complicated levels, you do not leave behind you the things you found on the simpler levels. You still have them, but combined in new ways, in ways you could not imagine if you knew only the simpler levels. The Christian account of God involves just the same principle. The human level is a simple and rather empty level. On the human level, one person is one being. Any two persons are two separate beings or 20 separate beings. Just as in two dimensions, one square is one figure and any two squares are two separate figures. On the divine level, you still find personalities. But up there you find them combined in new ways, which we, who do not live on that level, cannot imagine. There's the apophatic, right there. We cannot imagine what that's like. In God's dimension, so to speak, so to speak. In other words, if we're going to talk about it, we must what? Talk about it. We have to have some kind of image or frame of reference to understand it. You find a being who is three persons while remaining one being, just as a cube is 6 squares while remaining one cube. Of course, we cannot fully conceive a being like that. I can't even partially conceive a being like that. Just as if we were so made that we perceived only 2 dimensions in space, we could never properly imagine a cube. Get that? If we only existed in 2 dimensions, it would be impossible to imagine that 3rd dimension and that 3-dimensional shape. But we can get a sort of faint notion of it. An inkling, if you want. And when we do, we are then, for the first time in our lives, getting some positive idea, okay, that's cataphatic, some positive idea, however faint, of something super personal, something more than a person. It is something we could never have guessed, and yet once we've been told, one almost feels one ought to have been able to guess it. So he says, okay, so you ask a question. If we cannot imagine a 3-personal being, what is the good of talking about him? Well, there isn't any good talking about him. The thing that matters, this is so important, the thing that matters is being actually drawn into that 3-personal life. and that may begin at any time. That's theosis. Being drawn into that three-personal life that is rising up out of, metaphorically, our single line and becoming part of the square and becoming part of the cube above that. And if there were a fourth or fifth dimension, whatever that would be, that is going from glory to glory. It's the image Lewis gives us at the end of the Chronicles of Narnia. Anybody remember how?
Further up and further in.
Further up and further in. And how is Narnia described? It's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And it's always expanding. Okay? Just a couple more from here. This is from The Problem of Pain. 1940, as I said. This is in the chapter Divine Omnipotence. If God were good, he would wish to make his creatures perfectly happy. And if God were almighty, he would be able to do what he wished. But the creatures are not happy. Therefore, good logic here, God lacks either goodness or power or both. That is the problem of pain. Okay? That is cataphatic. That is saying in clear, rational terms. Terms that can be understood and defined. All right? Go from there to, which is this? You don't want to go there yet? No, I don't want to go there yet. It's grief observed, and I want to wait on that. Because I want to go to Till We Have Faces. How many of you have read Till We Have Faces? I know you two have. Okay. If you've never read this, you really have to. Robert and I were talking earlier, and he was saying how he hoped I would talk about The Great Divorce because it's his favorite book. And it's a fantastic book. If for no other reason, it's a depiction of George MacDonald. Okay? Which is fantastic. The Grief Observed, in my opinion, encapsulates all of C.S. Lewis. And here's what I mean by that. C.S. Lewis kind of has a bifurcated personality. He has two really strong halves to him. One side is this rational, logical, philosophical side. I mean, his first degree was in classics, philosophy. Okay? Not modern philosophy, but the philosophy of the ancient classics and stuff. All right? But then he has this other side that is romantic. Not romantic as in hearts and violins and everything, but romantic in the sense as in looking deep into the mystery of life, wanting fulfillment. What he called in his spiritual autobiography, joy, looking for joy, okay, which is an experience of heaven. So he has these two halves. And he even talks about having these two halves, okay? In his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he talks about, were it not for God's intervention, he probably would have gone down this dark path of romanticism into the occult and witchcraft. Because, part of him was really interested in that stuff. All right? But he found the works of George MacDonald, and he met others, etc. Okay? So what we see, I think, in his writings is we see this tension between these. We see a problem of pain, or the problem of pain. We see mere Christianity. We see miracles, and they're all over here on this logical, rational, reasonable side. And then we see, and Screwtape to some extent, but then we see also Screwtape, and we see Paralandra, the second book in the Space Trilogy, okay? Lion, Witch in the Wardrobe, and all the Chronicles of Narnia, and they're over here on this romantic side, this longing for side, this wanting to experience something, okay? And he hasn't united them. I think the reason he hasn't united them, and I'm really skating on thin ice with this, because he wasn't married. I think he thought he had the answers. I honestly do. And when he met his wife, he realized he didn't have the answers. Because living single as he did, even though he lived with his brother, all of his adult lives, living single as he did, he got very set in his ways. And then when his wife entered the picture, she enabled him to see things from a perspective not his own. And I don't mean that they were sitting there, around the dinner table, hammer and tongs every night. We are told that when those two would argue, however, sparks would fly, because she was every inch his intellectual equal, which says a lot for her, okay? So I think when he met her, and they talked about this myth, that's what enabled him to write this story. Because what we see in this story, Till We Have Faces, is essentially a young woman who's been taught by a Greek. And she's been taught Greek philosophy, rationalistic Greek philosophy. She's been taught not to believe in the gods. The gods aren't real. Even though the guy who teaches her every now and then will let slip something about the gods and says, oh, that's just, me, I can't help but. And there's a reason. It's because even his rationalism can't get him away from the gods. All right? So she has that aspect of her. And then she has this little sister named Psyche, okay, who is not the opposite, but she is the one who is totally in tune with nature, with the world, with depth, or if you want, spirituality. All right? And what happens in the novel is the sister gets taken away and killed, she thinks. Okay? And her problem, the major character, Orul is her name, her problem is that she doesn't like the gods. Why? Because the gods are mean and cruel. For example, she says, because the book is her argument against the gods. This is her way of saying, all right, you have to answer for yourselves. And she says, talking about, actually, this isn't she. This is a priest speaking. Okay? Because the girl's father is demanding to know something about the gods and such. And the Greek teacher is. And this is a priest of what's called Ungat, this fertility goddess, if you want, speaking. And he's talking about the Greeks and this Greek way of thought. They demand to see such things clearly, as if the gods were no more than letters written in a book. I know that they dazzle our eyes and flow in and out of one another like eddies on a river. And nothing that is said clearly can be said truly about them. That's apophatic theology. Okay? Holy places are dark places. It is life and strength, not knowledge in words, that we get in them. Come and taste, see that the Lord is good. It's not come and know. It's not come and know.
Read that last sentence again, please.
Come and taste.
Read that
Oh, in here?
Yeah.
It is life and strength, not knowledge in words, that we get in them, in the gods. Holy wisdom is not clear and thin like water, but thick and dark like blood. Why should the accursed, and he's talking about the daughter that has to be killed, why should the accursed not be both the best and the worst? His point is that the Greek wants everything to be clear. He wants everything to be known. He wants to be able to read it all on a page. And the priest says, it's not the way life is. That's not the way the gods are. The gods aren't clear. They're never clear. So, later on, Orul, the sister that the book is largely about and by, discovers that her little sister is still alive. She's gone off to the place where her sister was sacrificed to the god to gather what remains there are and bury them. But there are no remains. And so she goes over this little hill and goes down into this beautiful little valley that they never knew existed. I mean, it's like Shangri-La. It is beautiful. The rest of the kingdom, has been suffering and stuff, and this place is beautiful. And she goes in and she meets her sister. And it's been several weeks. Right? And her sister is dressed in what Orul sees as rags. But she's not thin and emaciated and wasted away. And so she doesn't understand this. And she tries to tell her sister, you've got to come back to Glom, that's their land, with me, etc., because you're going to starve. And the sister tells her, the little sister, Psyche, tells her, I'm married to the god. My dream, she says, all those dreams and visions I had as a child have been fulfilled. I am married to the god of the great mountain. This is my palace. Don't you see it? Okay, and she turns around and she, presses, her hand on a tree branch. And Orul's like, it's a tree branch. There's nothing there. No, it's a palace. You don't see the pinnacles. You don't see the towers. The older sister can't see anything but the forest. So she goes away. And then early the next morning, she comes back to the river, where this creek or stream where she saw her sister. And there's fog, and it's hazy, and it's early in the morning. And she gets down on her hands and knees to drink from the water. And she's down there drinking, pulling the water up to her mouth. She's on her knees. And she says, I got my drink ice cold, and I thought it steadied my mind. But would a river flowing in the God's secret valley do that? Or the clean contrary? This is another of the things to be guessed. For when I lifted my head and looked once more into the mist across the water, I saw that which brought my heart into my throat. There stood the palace, gray, as all things were gray in that hour and place, but solid and motionless. Wall within wall, pillar and arch and architrave, acres of it, a labyrinthine beauty. And while she's down there on her knees and looking across that stream, she sees this huge, think Windsor Palace, okay, just going on forever. If what I saw was real, I'm skipping several lines, I looked and looked to see if it would not fade or change. Then, as I rose, for all this time I was still kneeling where I had drunk, almost before I stood on my feet, the whole thing vanished. Why? Why does it vanish? That moment when I either saw or thought I saw the house, does it tell against the gods or against me? Would they make it a part of their defense? Say it was a sign, a hint, beckoning me to answer the riddle? Okay. Was it a true seeing? The cloud over my mortal eyes may have been lifted for a moment. Notice, she wants clear, direct revelation. She's like Gideon. She wants that fleece. She wants it wet one morning, dry the next morning, and wet again the next morning maybe. She needs good, solid proof that what she saw was real. But no, the gods aren't like that. Why? They set the riddle and then allow a seeming that can't be tested and can only quicken and thicken the tormenting whirlpool of your guesswork. If they had an honest intention to guide us, why is their guidance not plain? That's the question. All right? And we don't have time to do a lot more of this. But what she comes to at the end is she comes to this passage. It's just before she dies. And she says, when the time comes to you at which you will be forced at last to utter the speech which has lain at the center of your soul for years, which you have all that time idiot-like been saying over and over, you'll not talk about joy of words. I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly, nor let us answer. Till that word can be dug out of us, why should they hear the babble that we think we mean? The babble that we think we mean. How can they meet us face to face till we have faces? And here's what I think Lewis means by that. I think he probably has two things in mind when he writes that passage about till we have faces. One is that passage in 1 Corinthians that I read earlier. Okay? And the other is George MacDonald. In one of his two, and I can never remember which one, and I didn't look it up today. In one of his two fantasies for adults, Lilith or Phantastes, and I'm thinking it's Phantastes, the character, Anodos, runs into an old couple who are, and it just blows my mind every time I think about it. They are in the process of becoming. And what I mean by that is that they are an old couple who died. Okay? And they're skeletons. And as Anodos meets and talks with them, etc., he comes to understand that they are in the process of putting on flesh. In other words, they are in their process of becoming real. Real how? By losing all their sin. By losing all of their flaws. And by losing all of their flaws, they gradually, the flesh kind of creeps down the bones as they become what? Not only real, more understanding of each other, more accepting of each other, less critical of each other, more loving to each other. But it's not something that's done in a rational fashion. Okay? And here's how I think that applies here. When he says, how can the gods meet us face to face till we have faces? What does that mean? Till we know who we are? Okay? Till we know what is inside? No. Where does Christ say the kingdom of God exists? Within. I don't think it's an accident that he says that, and that he also says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and your neighbor as... Well, how can you love yourself? By finding the kingdom of God within. Okay? Here's how all this relates to Lewis. I think it took his meeting his wife, okay, for him to have, for lack of a better phrase, that outlet that he needed. He had a relationship, obviously, with his brother his whole life. But what did he not have to do with and for his brother? Give entirely of himself. Or, to put it another way, deny entirely himself. And it was only through that denial of himself, which is another expression of apophaticism. It's a denial of what one knows about oneself. Okay? It's only when he came to do that he really started to understand everything he was arguing about back in Mere Christianity, Problem of Pain, etc. Okay? Yeah. It's kenosis. It's self-emptying. And that then takes me to the last few minutes, a grief observed. His wife dies, and he is utterly distraught. And what does he say? If you've not read A Grief Observed, You're probably not familiar with this kind of language from it. When he says, hold on a second. Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, notice, if you remember, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. When everything's going great and you turn to God with thanks, it's like, hey, thank you, welcome home, kind of a thing. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face. There's Mother Teresa, praying repeatedly. Show me another sign. Give me another vision. Never happens. And a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? In other words, he's asking, and this is early, in a grief observed. He's asking, was it all a sham? Was it all just nonsense? Well, he gets through all that. He overcomes all of that to ultimately say, just two quotes, talking about the mystical union. The mystical union on the one hand, the resurrection of the body on the other. I can't reach the ghost of an image, a formula, or even a feeling that combines them. But the reality we're given to understand does. Reality, the iconoclast once more. What's an iconoclast? Someone who breaks images. How is reality an iconoclast? Have you ever, metaphorically banged your head against the wall and had to do it multiple times before you learned what the wall was trying to teach you? Okay. Exactly. Heaven will solve our problems, but not, I think, by showing us subtle reconciliations between all our apparently contradictory notions. The notions will all be knocked from under our feet. We shall see that there was never any problem. In other words, it's our lowly, false, limited conceptions that lie in the way. He goes on, earlier. He talked about, the notion, that we have of heaven from Sunday school and such. As a great big family reunion. Chicken wings and beer and, the whole 9 yards. And Lewis says, utterly ridiculous. And I think even the Orthodox faith teaches utterly ridiculous. Because from what the saints at least tell us, what is heaven? It's union with God. It's union with God. It's not being reunited with your aunt 4 times removed or something. Okay? It's union solely with God. And his last comment, talking about at the very end, when his wife died. Okay? He said to her, if you can. This is Lewis speaking. And he's selling this to Joy David Ben Gresham on her deathbed. If you can, if it is allowed, come to me when I too am on my deathbed. And she said, heaven would have a job to hold me, and as for hell, I'd break it into bits. There's a twinkle as well as a tear in her eye, but there's no myth and no joke. And he says, but I can't. Why? Because there is also the resurrection of the body. We cannot understand. The best is perhaps what we understand least. the best, perhaps, is what we understand least. That's the apophatic way. That if we try, I was going to say if we try not to understand, but that's not the point. If we admit that the best that we understand is as far as possible from the reality, then we start to understand. It's kind of like the old, what the oracle at Delphi said, had inscribed on the stone by it, know thyself. You know, so that when Socrates was told, you're the wisest man in the world, and he thought, it can't be true, because I'm not. And so he spent his entire life going out asking people questions, trying to find someone wiser. Well, what was he doing? He knew himself. That's why he was the wisest man in the world. So the wise man will admit, I don't know anything. The apophatic way essentially says, everything we think we know about God is so far from what is real and from what is really true that there's a certain point that we can get to, and then we just have to, as I once heard Father Hopko say in a tape, just shut up. Just shut up. And it's the way of hesychasm, which is the silence. You know, Hopko says in this one tape, and I'll stop with this, in this one tape, the word of the cross. What is ultimately the word of the cross? Silence. It's when Jesus doesn't say anything else, and it's just God hanging. That's it. All right, questions, comments, disputes?